Hi, I'm Ben Fried. I'm Google's CIO. I'm here with Ed Yourdon to talk about his new book, or new-ish book, CIOs at Work. CIOs at Work, there. See it? Where's the camera?
Not at play, just at work.
That would be a much shorter book. So anyway, a little bit about Ed, for those of you who might not know, might not have heard about him. Ed has been in the computing industry for over 40 years. Author of over 24 books, many articles. Is a consultant, an expert witness. He's written some, I think, kind of books that kind of iconically identify elements of the last 20 years in technology. I'm thinking of books with titles like Death March, Decline and Fall of the American Programmer, Rise and Resurrection of the American Programmer, as well as the work he did in the 70s on structured analysis and the work on object-oriented analysis and design that followed in the decades afterwards. As I said, the most recent book is CIOs at Work, which is interviews with 16 CIOs from kind of all walks of industry and organization, private companies, governmental organizations, in many industries. There's the CIOs, some of them include the CIOs of American Airlines, of Microsoft, NASA, Verizon, University of Miami, the Educational Testing Service. I would have some prime questions for the CIO of the place that does the SATs, but that's a different matter. and perhaps not least, the CIO of Google is also one of the interviews. Anyway, so a fascinating read, a very quick read. I recommend it. So some kind of background questions on the book. How long were you working on this, and what inspired you? What was kind of the objective that you had for the book?
Well, it went fairly quickly. The interviews themselves were only about an hour long, and they were spaced out over probably 6 months. The most time-consuming part turned out to be just the turnaround of getting things edited and getting various CIOs to own up to what they had said. And, oh my God, I have to take responsibility for this. But the reason I wrote the book was twofold. I wanted to provide some more attention and awareness and respect for this particular role that we now see everywhere. I don't think you're lacking any respect necessarily, but there are a lot of...
Oh, I do. But,
well, that's your problem.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of CIOs who I don't think are getting enough respect, and that's because even though we all know we live in the information age, the culture in a lot of companies is still based on how that particular company got started 100 years earlier. We've always made widgets. We're in the widget business. We praise and respect widget makers, and then we got some computers over here because the widgets used to be just bare metal, but now they've got a couple of computers in them, and so somebody has to look after that. And I was curious to see what role the CIOs actually were playing in a lot of these companies, beyond just keeping the lights on, running the networks and the data centers and so on. And it was very interesting to see how CIOs are trying to help their companies become more profitable doing whatever they are doing, as well as looking for completely new opportunities in areas that they're not doing at all right now.
So I think one of the things that I'm really excited about the opportunity to interview you is that unlike some of your previous works, yours is a much quieter voice in the sense that yours is the voice of the interviewer as opposed to attempting to add a commentary. And the commentary sometimes does come out in the form of questions and the way you direct the dialogue, but it's certainly the voice of the opinions of the people you interviewed far more so than yours. So I'm really interested in taking this opportunity now to learn a little bit about what you concluded, or kind of the opinions that maybe you don't share that are actually in the book. And I guess the first one I have along those lines is how similar or different is the role of the CIO across all of these tremendously diverse organizations, right?
Well, it is relatively similar, I think. Of course, there is a great deal of diversity in the organizations, particularly between the public sector organizations and private sector. I interviewed the CIO of the United States, which is kind of cool, as well as the CIO of the British Parliament. And there's an organization that's 1,000 years old that still has data written on scrolls of parchment that they have to maintain. But within the private sector, as I was saying a moment ago, most CIOs have the common role of just running the operation, the computer side of the operation. But in terms of helping their companies figure out where new areas of business might be located, that was quite different from one company to another. In some of the companies, I got the sense that they really weren't involved in that at all. And in most companies, they were still heavily focused on helping the business unit managers do a more effective or more efficient or more competitive job at the businesses that they were already in.
Now, are the differences in these IT organizations and CIO roles functions of the organization's age or culture or industry?
To me, it was more age and size than anything else. I mean, obviously, there's some difference between the companies like you guys that are doing nothing but information, or other computer companies, versus the widget manufacturers of the world, the auto companies and whatnot. But there's, I think, a profound difference between a company, well, order of magnitude like you guys, being 10 years old with 10,000 employees, versus a company that's 100 years old with 100,000 employees. Just an enormous difference. And you see that reflected on several different levels. It means the CIO, unlike someone of your age, is likely to be someone in their 60s and who vividly remembers what it was like, 40 or 50 years ago.
So I guess given such diversity and differences in age companies, is there some kind of conventional path for these people that they've followed to have gotten into the seat that they're in?
It turns out not. Indeed, one of the surprises I got, one of the things I didn't expect, is that at least when they talked to me, knowing that they were going to be on the record, virtually all of these people said they had no aspiration to become a CIO when they started, and nor did they have any idea what they were going to do if and when that role ever ended. I mean, clearly all of them had moved into some kind of management-oriented path. They may have started off, indeed some of them did, many of them did start off as technicians, and there were a few, including, for example, the CIO of the New York Stock Exchange with a PhD, not necessarily in computer science, but people with a really strong technical education and a strong technical beginning to their career, for whatever reason, moved into management, and they just went from one step to the next. But they all said that was not part of their plan starting out. Nor did they have any strong advice in terms of education or preparation for those who might aspire to be a CIO. I said, is it really important to get an MBA? Generally they all said no. Is it really important to have a computer science degree or EE or something like that? And I got a lot of wishy-washy answers, not a lot of.
One of the more surprising things I saw was that Tony Scott, the CIO of Microsoft and previously of Disney and CTO of General Motors, or divisional CTO of General Motors, I'm not really sure, and so on. His degree is in Parks and Recreation.
Yes. Not from the TV show, but it turned out, as was often true back in the 70s, that people in a variety of the most unlikely sorts of jobs and industries and professions stumbled into computers one way or another, and often they were the only ones in the entire organization, so they became the star, the wizard, and that launched their career. Most of them did say to me that they had also found a mentor, usually unwittingly or even unknowingly, but somebody who really set them on a path that ultimately led them to a CIO position.
So, I mean, you talked about kind of the surprises that you encountered in the book, in researching the book. What were the other big surprises, the unexpecteds, that came out through the interviews?
The main one was this idea that they had no idea where they were likely to go. And I was surprised that none of them at least admitted to me that they wanted to be a CEO. And it might seem to be the next logical step. And that none of them had started off with that role in mind, that they had just kind of fallen into the job. I'm sure there were some other surprises that will come to me probably as we continue talking, but that was the one that really occurred to me the most.
And what were the, I guess so it sounds like you're saying the biggest thing that the CIOs have in common is this operational responsibility. Is that true? I was kind of wondering where if you had a cocktail party with all these people and brought all the CIOs together, what would they all kind of converge on as things that they had in common?
They all have in common this operational responsibility, but I don't want to say they take it for granted, but they just assume that that's done. That's okay. Curiously, now that you've started raising these questions, I was expecting a lot more of them to say we have an enormously difficult job getting our projects finished on time, which is kind of an operational responsibility. And it's been kind of the central part of my career, helping people figure out how to get systems built on time that actually do the right job. None of them admitted to any difficulties there. They seemed to feel that they had that under control. They all worried about security, in terms of convergence. Yeah. If I got a bunch of these people in a cocktail party and said, what's the thing that keeps you awake at night? I asked you this question too.
Yeah.
Every single one of them said security, followed immediately by the statement that they had the best security people in the world, which I thought was rather amusing. But none of them seemed to think, or at least admit, that security attacks could put them out of business permanently. They all certainly said it could cost us a lot of money, it could disrupt our business, it could do various bad things. But what they worry about, at night in the privacy of their own home might be different. But in any case, security was the single area of convergence.
Now, on the subject of this cocktail party, I've hypothesized that it might actually not be such a spectacular event because I think a lot of people tend to think of IT and thus CIOs as being cautious, conservative, slow-moving, ergo not such a successful cocktail party, perhaps. First of all, I mean, have you observed that to be true in these conversations? And secondly, why do you think that is?
Well, I think it is true, and I think there are two main reasons for it. One is the corporate reason, and the other is the personal reason. As I was saying a little bit earlier, there's a profound difference between a company that's 100 years old, that's been building widgets for 100 years, and has a legacy and has a culture. I mean, you have to ask yourself, for example, why is it that Kodak could not have created Instagram and instead was busily going bankrupt at that very moment? That's even more important for me personally because I happen to know personally that in the early to mid 80s, a new CEO came into Kodak and said, we're now in the information age, digital is going to be important. Kodak, by the way, also invented the digital camera. And the Kodak culture said, oh my God, what are we going to do? We better go buy some computer companies because we don't know anything about this stuff. And they bought my company, which is why I know about all of this. A year later, the CEO was gone. He was running Ross Perot's presidential campaign, which was interesting. And then the Kodak culture said, why do we have these computer companies? And they sold us off and went back to making little yellow boxes. And they could not change their culture. And I think that's one reason that the CIO is immersed in this culture that finds it incredibly difficult to change. And you guys may feel that that doesn't affect you right now. I get the impression that some folks at Google are beginning to talk about it and worry about it, but you're only 10 or 12 years old. When you're 50 or 100 years old, it's really a profound thing. And on a personal level, for the bigger, older companies, you're talking about people who have reached the pinnacle of their career after 40 or 50 years. So they're used to rising up through the organizational hierarchy. They're used to the political games. And they're used to being very visible. They're also used to about a decade of experience where the life expectancy of a CIO is 18 months. So they're very cautious and very conservative. They're also very accustomed, they have been until very recently, when companies like Google began turning things upside down, they're used to having the vendors coming in and telling them what's in the technology pipeline, what's coming along, when's the next mainframe going to appear. They're used to the big consulting firms like Accenture and McKinsey coming in to lay out their wisdom. So that just tends to make them very cautious and conservative, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the next question I had is one that I struggle with a lot, which is, I don't know if you're a fan of old comic books. In the first issue of Detective Comics, Bruce Wayne has decided to become a superhero, and he's sitting under a window contemplating, what his approach to crime fighting will be, and a bat flies through the enormous Gothic window of Wayne Mansion. And he says, "That's it, I'll take the form of a bat." He says something like, "Criminals are a cowardly, superstitious lot, and I'll strike fear into their hearts." And I've always thought that phrase, not always, but I've come to realize that maybe that phrase, "criminals are a cowardly, superstitious lot," could also be applied to CIOs. Whether that's a deep comment on my own psyche or not, I'll leave to the audience to determine. But I think the kind of existential question that I actually have is it, technology is such a fundamental source of disruption, right? Information technology is such a fundamental source of disruption. Is it possible for the CIO to actually be the agent of that disruption, or are they fundamentally a force of moderation in that disruption? I mean, one of the things you mentioned in the book is that BYOD, bring your own device, iPads coming into the workforce, right, has been kind of one of the big sea changes. Several people talk about it. Vivek Kundra and others kind of talk about it and the importance of that. But CIOs didn't create that. CIOs were forced to deal with that, right? So I guess the question is there this existential dilemma which is taken in the form that the tools which we ask CIOs to invest themselves in, they are fundamentally unable to realize the full capability of, which is the maximal power to disrupt within their organizations?
That's probably true. That is probably true. It's particularly interesting with this BYOD and also social network phenomenon. Part of what I was expecting when I went through these interviews was the same uniform rejection that I had seen about 4 or 5 years ago, which sometimes seems like a lifetime, but it's not that far ago. If you talk to the average CIO in 2007 or 8, he would say it's a communist plot. It's evil. We're going to keep it outside the corporate walls. Blah 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 blah. 2 or 3 years ago, they were grudgingly allowing some of this stuff to happen, but they really weren't happy. And now, at least when you talk to them, they give you the impression that they're on board and that they're in favor of it and so on. But as you say, they certainly were not leading the charge. And part of that, I think, goes back to this issue of a generation of CIOs that's as old as I am, and who remembers growing up in an era when computers were scarce and expensive and had to be protected and controlled, and where anything that disrupted the status quo was just viewed, with great terror. And then I think you had, generations of technology-based companies that were rebellious and disruptive and so on when they began, but then after a couple of decades, look at Microsoft.
They become established, right?
They're
part of the firmament. Yeah.
And it's particularly ironic when you read that Bill Gates spent enormous amounts of time studying how it was that IBM and DEC had missed, the next generation of tidal waves and what he could do to prevent it. But now, they've got a culture that they will fight tooth and nail to protect and defend.
That's fascinating. I mean, the kind of the bureaucratic inertia is this incredible force, isn't it, inside these large organizations?
And yet there are some tidal forces that they seem to be very much aware of and very much behind. When I asked the typical CIO what they thought was going to be the important technology of the next few years, I mean, everybody said mobile computing is just getting started and it will be far more powerful and important than we can possibly imagine. Everybody was in favor of cloud computing. And this is one that I think will also illustrate this generational difference. Everybody said Moore's law will continue indefinitely. Now, that probably doesn't mean anything to you guys because it's been true your entire lives.
How's that going to happen? We can't scale up clock frequency.
Well,
faster,
but the thing that's important, again, imagine a CIO who was in his mid-60s like me and who remember, I don't know if any of you remember when Moore's law was published, when that paper was published. It was a mere 47 years and 11 days ago, on April 19th, 1965. It was about a month before I graduated from college. You're welcome to look it up. There's this search engine that might be of some use to you. But what you may not be aware of is that when that paper was published, Gordon Moore said, I think this amazing phenomenon is going to continue for 10 years. And so people of my generation said, wow, that means we're going to have this enormous run for 10 years and then we'll coast the rest of our lives. Well, 10 years later, Intel said, you know what, it might actually go on for another 10 years. And then they said another 10 years. And now the latest estimate I've heard is that it'll keep going until 2026, by which time I won't care one way or another. But I think that a lot of today's CIOs are saying we don't know how it's going to happen, we don't know what's doing it, we're not, inside Intel, we don't know, the basic technology that's going to make it happen, but we're taking it on faith that it'll continue, which is an interesting thing, and one for you guys to think about yourself. Is this something you should take for granted for the rest of your career, that every 18 months computer power will double? What if that should stop being true someday? Then what?
Wow.
Yeah. There's a metaphysical question.
Yeah, and then all those algorithms become really important, right? You can't just rely on, faster clock speed, slower dies, smaller dies, et cetera. Here's an unknown unknowns kind of question for you. So what did you not hear that surprised you? And kind of what's not on CIOs' minds that you think should be, is another way of...
I would say that the one that occurred to me most was the importance of the, your term, social contract. This notion that you actually have to do something to make a place interesting and challenging and exciting to work at. They still seem to take it for granted that it's going to happen, and that they don't really have to do very much to make it happen. And so you don't even have to talk about it. Or if you ask a couple of questions, they rear back. One of the questions I asked several of the CIOs is whether they had heard of this phenomenon of groups of college graduates applying for a job en masse.
Like we were a team in college, we want to be a team at our first employer,
it's
right?
either all of us or none of us.
Yeah.
Almost every CIO that I asked that question, gave me a knee-jerk reaction.
Like, I would never want that? Or
I
would never want to hire them?
It's bad, it's evil.
Communist.
Yeah. But it was also clear that they had never even thought of the question before that. And the term that you used of social contract was something that I didn't get the impression had really entered their consciousness, that, this idea of a two-way relationship. Now, again, that's interesting for my generation, because when we graduated, my friends and I, there was a social contract. You went to work for IBM, and it was a job for life. And you were guaranteed to get a pension when you were 65, if you were still alive.
Yeah.
And
guaranteed benefit pension, I would add, too. But,
but that all disappeared 10 or 20 years later. And now it's coming back in some organizations, but not in most, I think.
So, I had a great question on the tip of my tongue, and of course, the eloquence of your answer has wiped it from my mind. I know what it is. So, although the social contract might have been something you did not hear much of, there was Paul Strassman, right, from NASA, and kind of a storied, been a CIO for 50 years or something like that at one place or another. He did make a comment that I thought was consistent with this idea of the social contract, or certainly you could kind of put in the continuum of thought that leads to it, which is that in the early days of computing, when he was first a CIO, the capital, the computer was the dominant expense, and the people were cheap, right? And I think that in some sense, the social contract may exist because that proposition has been inverted, right? And computers are, relatively speaking, inexpensive, and people, with the talent needed to do significant things with them, is incredibly expensive. Did that kind of, I view that as kind of the precursor to realizing that there needs to be a social contract. Did that kind of theme about the changes in capital structure versus
I didn't see that come up.
Cost of staffing come up?
I didn't, and it's interesting that you raised that because this gentleman, Paul Strassman, is an amazing man. I mean, without trying to get commercial, this book is worth reading just for the Paul Strassman interview, if not for Ben's interview. This is a man in his early 80s. He fought in the Czech underground during World War II. He was the CIO at Xerox when Xerox PARC was being created, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And though he certainly did make that comment about this turnaround of the relative cost of computer gear versus people, he was also very critical of the current generation coming out of college. He was very concerned that they're too superficial and too shallow, and not, really properly educated in, fundamentals. But he certainly did put that emphasis on the expensive nature of people today, which everybody's aware of, except that we are still very much stuck in this phenomenon of there are lots of cheap people over there in India or in various other parts of the world. So if people here are too expensive, we'll just outsource it and make the cost go away. That's been going on for about 10 years.
Yeah.
And everybody knows that it probably was never true completely and certainly won't continue to be as true in the future. But I think that still is a major factor driving a lot of companies today.
Certainly, if you believe in free trade, then ultimately you believe that the cost of labor is going to equalize over time, right? I mean, I believe that's from my scattered reading of The Economist, I believe that's kind of one of the principles is that ultimately there'll be equalization, right?
Yeah, yeah. By the way, you've reminded me of another thing that didn't come up for conversation very often, and whenever it did, I wasn't sure I trusted the kind of glib answers I was getting from CIOs, and that was the relative importance of free software, particularly when put in the hands of people whose labor costs are minimal at the moment, of which obviously you guys have got several wonderful examples. And when I began asking CIOs of more traditional companies, how important is it going to be for 1 million people in Africa or 1 million people in Asia or 1 million people anywhere to use free tools on essentially free mobile devices to create valuable stuff, they said, oh yeah, it's important. And you didn't feel that there was anything behind that.
Do you think that CIOs, especially at kind of larger and more established companies, are they close enough to the domain, to technology anymore? I mean, I wonder if the reason for that question is because if your job at some point is to manage a large organization and a large budget and a group of managers who manage other managers who manage other managers and so on, it can become hard to have these insights that really require one to stand at the coalface of the problem, right? Since you yourself, you own the coal mine, you don't stand at the coalface perhaps, right?
That may be true, particularly if you have not had your company's and your empire's existence threatened by such things. I had a good example myself, or a good experience myself in that area just a couple of months ago. I took one of these weekend photography seminars here at the International Center of Photography. It was a weekend course on doing photography with your iPhone. And with the current model of iPhone, you've got a decent camera finally. But what I didn't appreciate was the enormous variety of apps that are anywhere from 99 cents to $0, which collectively are almost equivalent to Photoshop. And I thought, man, if I were the king of the Photoshop empire, I would be terrified.
Yeah.
Because there's this stuff out there that is just amazing to see what it'll do. And if that's true for digital photography, it's true for any number of other things.
And is that emergence the rise of accountable for the rise of free software? Or is that a function of, is that yet another one of the ways in which technology serving consumers first is kind of different from the past?
I think it's all of those things. I think, yes, it certainly does depend, at least to some extent, on the idea of going after the consumer marketplace first, and then later on bringing it into the company and percolating upwards. I think it's also a function of what Clay Shirky calls the cognitive surplus. You've got an awful lot of people with time on their hands, maybe 3 hours in the evening, and free computing power who say, I can create a clever little app which does one little thing but has clean interfaces.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the Unix paradigm as well, so that it can be connected to other things that I don't even know about yet. I think it's several of those things that are all converging to create a collective impact that again, the traditional CIO, who's got a very big empire, I think is incapable of recognizing.
Yeah, it's kind of I think these are the things that make our industry so fascinating, right? How many other industries change so much over the course of 5-10 years, right?
Yeah.
So along the subject of kind of change and based on what's happened since you started the book, for example, or based on what you learned by writing it, are there questions you wish you had asked but didn't?
Sure, yeah. One of the questions I was particularly interested in, and actually thought I'd be able to ask but couldn't, was how companies that are in the same industry are using information to compete against each other effectively. You look in the auto industry, how is it that Honda, Toyota, and General Motors and so on compete using information? Take the financial services industry. Actually, that one also illustrated another one of the biggest surprises that I had when working on this book, which was the number of companies that were not about to let me talk to their CIO. I anticipated that, with CIOs who were too busy. I tried to get the new CIO of General Motors, too busy. I knew that some CIOs would be embarrassed.
He's no longer there. By
Oh,
the
is
way.
that right?
But yeah, they changed CIOs recently. Yeah.
Oh dear. Oh well.
I think less than 18 months.
I'm not surprised, actually. I tried to get the CIO of British Petroleum a few months after the Gulf War. Well, I knew that was a lost cause. But then there were the CIOs of the Wall Street financial community. And there I got just this hostile stonewall of resistance. They did not want to talk to me at all, which I had not anticipated. But if I had been able to talk to the CIO of Goldman Sachs and Merrill Lynch and blah blah blah, all this, I'd want to know how could they use information effectively to compete against each other, and I suspect I would not have gotten a very full answer because you're kind of giving away the crown jewel.
The irony is almost everyone who works in IT on Wall Street, which is thousands of people here, has some idea of the answer to that question, right? I mean, it's the kind of the interesting, unusual things that they've done all become widely known. People I worked in Wall Street for a while, so I know a little bit about it. But there's so much movement, and historically there's so much movement from IT department to IT department, right? That
Right.
If someone spends a decade in Wall Street IT, chances are they know people who've been at, or if they themselves have not been in each one of these major companies, and they know something about what their IT secret sauce is or was in a particular area.
Probably so. The other question I wish I had been able to ask, but probably would not have gotten a straight answer to, is how the decision making goes up the chain of command if the company is facing a severe crisis that was ultimately caused by a computer problem. And what made me think about it was all the news that we were hearing about a year ago about the alleged engineering problems in Toyota's automobiles.
Right. This is what was it? The floor mats or
the floor mat or
accelerator
the brake pedal
or the brake pedal, whatever. Yeah.
Now, there was a lot of talk that was a software problem.
Right, because it turns out the brake pedal or the accelerator doesn't actually control the flow of gas. I mean, I'm a New Yorker. I don't really understand cars, so I'm not the right person to add. But apparently, it's multiple servos and AD converters and so on, and low-level controller software. It's not actually. I thought it was just it's a lever controlling a valve somewhere, but no, that's naive of me.
And you can imagine a number of other companies in a variety of industries where a flaw of some kind, either hardware or software or combined, ultimately causes a severe crisis that causes a management reaction up the chain of command, so that ultimately some decision or statement is made by a vice president who probably doesn't know anything at all about the underlying engineering. And I was curious to see how that might take place in a Japanese company versus an American company versus a German company, and
there have been these other interesting examples that kind of speak to something similar to that. There was the centrifuges in Iran, right, which were destroyed by Siemens. They used a Siemens industrial controller,
right.
And probably some nation state introduced this software attack into these things that actually permanently damaged these difficult to obtain ultracentrifuges, right? But that's another example of software having such a real concrete problem in the operation of an organization.
Yeah.
And then there's all these people working on software and critical infrastructure, and it's gotten to the point where it's too depressing for me to read what these people find. You find these videos of a bug that causes a steam generator to explode or things like that,
Well, it's interesting you mentioned the Iran thing. Again, the question is, how did that discovery of the Siemens problem actually percolate up the chain of command, and how many people got executed as a result?
I don't think my next CIO job will be in Iran. Yeah.
Or North Korea, hopefully.
Yeah. Oh, that's right. Yeah. Failure to launch. Right. So,
yeah. So I think those are the main questions I wish I'd been able to ask. Since computers are so essential to virtually everything that any company is doing these days doesn't always go right. And when there are severe problems, how does the executive leadership deal with it if they've come from an era that didn't really understand the technology to begin with?
So, I mean, I think that this raises a really interesting point, which is that computers are critical everywhere, right? And they're in everything. They're in the gas pedal, right? I mean, they're in things that certainly I didn't expect to be kind of computational devices, right? Having met with CIOs from so many diverse industries, do you think that there is enough talent, enough kind of computing talent in the world to support this use of, the fact that computers are everywhere? Do you think that they all have access to the people that they need to do the jobs they need to do? I mean, this isn't just the kind of can you hire enough people question. I'm trying to ask the slightly deeper version of that, which is do these organizations actually function at the level that they need to?
Well, that is a philosophical question that could keep us going for quite a long time. When I was just getting started in the field, there were people like Edgar Dijkstra arguing that we shouldn't even be attempting to build things as complex as we're building because we have no hope of ever proving that they're running correctly.
Yeah.
So that we ought to scale down our expectations and do very simple things. Well, obviously society hasn't agreed with that. So I think what's happening is that we and our various companies are building things right up to some threshold of collapse and failure and muddling along. I don't think most companies have the caliber of talent that they really need in their IT department. It was because of that, quite frankly, that I was so concerned that the Y2K problem would be much bigger than it turned out to be. And actually, it turned out to be much bigger than the newspapers ever admitted, but that's another whole discussion. But, we've got these systems that are barely wobbling along, and a major disruption of almost any kind could bring them to their knees, whether it's competitive or, economic or malicious. I mean, that's, of course, one of the things that we have to be a lot more worried about today than we might have even 10 years ago is the malicious, deliberate intent to bring our systems down.
Yeah, I like the way Strassman kind of referred to the kind of the Marshall implications of computing. And is one concerned about infiltration? Is one concerned about exfiltration? Is it there've always been attacks on the supply chain? Or maybe it was Vivek who talked about there's always been attacks on the supply chain, and now the supply chain is cyber as well, right?
Yeah. And he's doing a lot of consulting and a lot of lecturing down in the Pentagon on those topics.
So was there a CIO you wish you could have interviewed but didn't, or who was there one you thought this man or woman would have really been?
Well, there were a bunch that I'd wish I had been able to interview. I didn't get anybody from the auto industry, and given the number of computers and the amount of code that is in the typical automobile today, I really wish I'd been able to get a bit more of an insight. I mean, I wonder how worried they are whenever any car goes roaring down the highway. Is this stuff actually going to work?
Yeah. There's a group, I think, at UCSD that looks at IT in cars and kind of attacks on them and so on. It's fascinating stuff. I could send you some papers on the attacks on these the car area networks and how you can kind of get into the control systems from the peripheral systems. It's scary, but especially for someone like me who's a New Yorker and doesn't really drive much. But
and some of the critical infrastructure people, I wish I'd been able to have more interviews with them. I interviewed a couple of people from traditional utility companies, but even they are involved in some pretty amazing things these days in terms of the concerns that they expressed about what would happen if their part of the grid came down. So it would have been interesting to hear a bit more about that. But there's always time for another books.
Yeah, well, good. I'm glad to hear it. It was the book was a great read. I think we're probably at the time when we should go to questions. Is there? I don't know if there was a moderator page with questions put up, or if we're going to do just questions, live questions from the audience. Are there questions from the audience? All right, a brave man.
There's always the icebreaker.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, thanks for coming. So you mentioned cloud computing early on and how you said that was one of the issues that kind of across the board you were hearing CIOs say that was going to be in the near-term future of what they were considering for their operation. One thing I always thought was that would be interesting about that is the fact that fundamentally, if you want to do it right, and obviously we at Google, big bet on cloud computing, you have to actually give up some of the control you have as a CIO. Did you see any of that kind of playing out in your discussion, and what were the CIO's opinions towards that?
I didn't hear that connection between acceptance of cloud computing and loss of control, which is an interesting one. Actually, more commonly, I heard the opinion from some of these older CIOs that cloud computing is just a new word for an old idea, blah, 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 blah. But the general point about giving up control is one that had occurred to me in a couple of other respects that also did not get addressed. One of the things I wanted to ask about was agile computing. And they were all in favor of it. Everybody thought it was a great idea. But when you listen to them, they just thought it meant doing the same old stuff faster. As opposed to some of the stronger opinions about agile computing that does require giving a lot of centralized control. But on the subject of cloud computing, no. I don't know whether they were in favor of it or against it. We didn't get there in that part of the discussion. They all just agreed that, whereas again, 5 years ago they would have said never, over my dead body, blah, blah, blah. And then 3 years ago they said, nah. Now they will tell you some concerns and cautions, and they'll point to a trouble or a horror story somewhere that they've seen in the trade journals, but they all know that it's coming. And a lot of them will say it's a good thing. But the idea that it may require them to give up some control, like I was saying before, I think that that's a really deep cultural thing in a lot of these companies, that they've had a mindset of control for 30 or 40 years, particularly because computing hardware and networks and databases and so on were amongst the most precious and most scarce and most expensive resources and assets that a company had. So it had to be controlled and protected. And the idea that it's now free and plentiful and pervasive and so on, they're still getting used to that idea.
So I thought on the, sorry, did you have a follow-up question? Because
thank you.
I thought on the subject of the cloud, I thought the interview with Vivek Kundra, who was the United States CIO at the time, was fascinating, because unlike many of your CIOs, essentially, he was dropped in at the top of an the federal government spends, I think he says, $80 billion in that, and that's not including the black part of the budget, right? That's just kind of, there's $80 billion we can see that they spend on IT, and it's controlled by these departmental CIOs, right? I mean, they have entire conferences of federal CIOs, as I understand it. There's lots and lots and lots of them. And here's this guy dropped in kind of on top of all these people. He had very little actual authority over them, right? But trying to give his boss and the American people, levers and transparency into what was going on in all of these small IT organizations. And for him, the cloud was incredibly important because there was so much waste, right? There are 2,000 federal data centers or something like that operating at 26% utilization, if I'm something along those lines. I was fascinated to read, here's a CIO who's actually trying to be an agent of change and is trying to kind of fight the forces of inertia that existed at this lower level of CIO underneath him. I thought that was, in that way, the interview with him was very different from most of the others, where all these people were kind of much more the commanders of their organizations, I guess.
That's true, although Vivek Kundra left about a month after I conducted the interview. And it's interesting also that nearly 30 years ago, Paul Strassman, whose name we mentioned already, was a deputy secretary of the Defense Department in charge of their IT, and said the same thing, 2,000 data centers, blah, 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 and I'm going to change it. And he was ready to shoot them all if he had to, given his Czech military background. But he said what he had not anticipated was how stubborn these people could be, knowing full well that when the next administration came along, he'd be gone. And these people are protecting their empire over a 20-year period, their career, and they can outlast you. They can hold their breath, so they don't really care. It was interesting seeing Vivek Kundra's thing. To me, one of the more interesting examples or stories from this Vivek Kundra interview was his very simple experiment in the city of Washington to get people to write little smartphone apps. And he didn't pay them all, but he said, I'm going to have a contest, and the winner gets, I think, $1,000 or something like that. And he ended up with dozens, if not hundreds, of smartphone apps that have been created by ordinary citizens and contributed, whose collective business value was astronomical. So this idea that society is available and has got a lot of smart people, and that we can take advantage of crowd computing and so on. I think they really woke up a lot of people in the Washington bureaucracy. We got a question here.
Yeah, so I guess I have a meta question since you're talking about culture so much. So in computing, of course, it's generally a young field, and we all hit college and we knew that we knew how to do it. And these people 20 years older than us were dinosaurs using mainframes or Windows or whatever their old tech du jour was. And of course, now that by the time you're the CIO, you've kind of almost become, I won't necessarily say dinosaur, particularly as Ben's my boss. But
I think of myself more as a woolly mammoth, but yeah.
But I'm curious, how did the CIOs come across as kind of, oh, these kids are snapping at my heels and this is change, or do they come across as, this is awesome, the world's changing, new tech?
Well, I think it was in between. I think Ben has expressed some frustration that they don't seem to be radical enough or aggressive enough, and so on. I was expecting the first characterization of this generation of young kids. They're unmanageable and they're unwatched and they're uncivil and blah blah blah. I didn't get that at all. And I asked that question of just about everyone, and was surprised by how positive they were about the education, the skills, the work ethic, and everything else you could imagine of the current generation of college graduates, with the exception of Paul Strassman, who said that they were shallow and superficial and glib and that they expected too much and so on. But generally, they were all very, very positive, which was encouraging. And this was from a group of CIOs that ranged from their late 20s, early 30s, up to their early to mid 60s. And so the older ones I was expecting to be very negative, with lots of stories about the good old days when men were men and we all walked to work barefoot and so on. I didn't get that, which was interesting.
Thank you.
Okay.
You use the microphone so you can be recorded for posterity.
So just a little follow-up to that question. Did they talk in specific about any kind of changes that they could foresee about with the younger generation coming into workforce, who are perhaps more comfortable and more familiar with technology, either in the IT department or any other area of the business, good or bad?
I didn't hear that discussed in terms of changes, but rather just one of the positive attributes of the younger generation, that they were more familiar and had been exposed to computers their entire life and probably had gotten more of an education in whatever computing sciences were appropriate than had their own generation, many of whom came out of school with all kinds of non-computer related degrees and had to scramble a bit to pick it up. So they were generally positive. And they didn't seem to suggest, well, they suggested that it was going to perhaps lead to a better work-home life balance, because it was less likely than it had been a generation before that people would work 7 days a week, 18 hours a day, until they dropped from exhaustion at age 32 or 65 or whatever. But aside from that, I didn't hear anything. The other thing that was interesting, by the way, just going into the broader area of change, when I said, what do you see in the future? They all said I would be crazy to make a prediction about anything more than 18 months or 2 years in the future. Whereas if I had written this book 10 years ago, they all would have given me grand predictions about where they thought technology was going. And that's probably because that's what they were hearing from IBM and Accenture and whoever. They were so used to the idea of the vendors will come talk to us and we'll tell them what we need and they will tell us what they're doing. And so we'll be able to see 5 years into the future. And there were lots of 5-year plans, 10 or 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And they weren't doing that this time around. So that was encouraging.
Great, thanks.
Sure. I think we got another question.
Yeah.
Yes. Hi. First, I want to thank you for what you said about Y2K in the 90s, because it really, I think it kicked everyone's butt in a way that needed to happen, and that people wouldn't have paid attention to the issue if people weren't saying what the things you were saying.
Well, thank you, but I took a lot of heat for it.
And that's why I want to give you some gratitude, because I saw huge projects that were really needed, and they wouldn't have happened any other way. Actually, my question has nothing to do with that, though. I was wondering, you mentioned most CIOs tended to fall into the field, and obviously there's no, you can't go to college and major in CIO-ness. But I'm concerned that so much of the computing world is staffed by people that fell into it. And I was wondering, and the reason for that is I think computing is becoming like the air we breathe. It's very important, and or as important as healthcare. And I'd rather go to a doctor that followed a prescribed educational plan to become a doctor than one that was kind of, fooling around with medicine in his home and decided to go into this field. So my point, and I do have one, is what do you see is needed in the educational field for IT and computer science in the next 5 or 10 years?
Wow, that's another kind of philosophical question that could keep us occupied all day. The fact that a lot of employers now feel they have the luxury of insisting on a computer science degree or a software engineering degree is certainly a radical change from when I entered the field. In fact, when I graduated from MIT, there was no computer science degree. Mm-hmm. So employers said, math, electrical engineering, mechanical engineering, astrophysics, anything. So that has changed. Now they can say, we want to hire people from this level of university with these kinds of recognized diplomas. But within the academic institutions themselves, there has been a lot of soul searching for the last 40 or 50 years of what should we be teaching this year? Is it still relevant to teach language X, given that nobody in the real world is using it anymore? And I think that's going to continue as long as our technology continues changing as rapidly as it does, because it's very hard for the institutions to change that rapidly themselves. There's a deeper and more controversial question behind what you've asked, though, that I thought you were going to get into, and that has to do with licensing of IT people. As I understand it, a doctor is not allowed to practice unless he's not only gone through medical school, but also has a license of some sort, which is true of a lot of fields, not software, and I don't think that's going to happen in our lifetime. So
we have certifications which are taking that role, at least for the lower level positions, I think.
Yeah, though, again, we could get into a long philosophical discussion. The certification in some cases is a demonstration that you know how to use certain tools. You can get a Microsoft certification and all kinds of things that may not indicate whether you really know anything at all about computing. But as I understand it, you're not allowed to build a bridge or a building unless you have a license from some engineering society that provides at least some confidence that it won't fall down the minute you finish building it. And that's not very much true in the computing field at all. Mm-hmm. And there was no discussion. That's one of the questions I wish I had asked of the CIO. Do you think we should be insisting on licensing of computer people? Because I probably would have gotten a variety of answers. I'm not sure what it would have been.
Thank you.
So maybe a final, I think we're just about out of time, maybe a final question for you, also kind of in the philosophical realm as well. But looking at so many people, in some of the people you interviewed, identified consumerization of IT as such a trend. And if you look at so much of the wave of cloud computing and BYOD and kind of all the trends that were frequently identified, I think it makes me want to ask the question of, will IT be necessary? And in 15 years, right? Or for example, if you wanted to have your own stealth sales force right now inside some company, all you need is a web browser, right? To use Salesforce and you could use PayPal or whatever or Google Wallet to manage your or Square, right? Whatever you can handle payments any number of ways. You can have CRM tools. You can kind of name almost any part of what you want to do, and you can just get access to it all through a web browser without the IT department having to do anything for you. And is the logical conclusion of this that kind of the shores lick at more and more and more of the sands of IT, leaving us a smaller and smaller island to manage or defend, that people need less and less from it? Not that does technology go away, but does the notion of the department that's responsible for technology, is that as dated as like reading about terms like the motor pool or something like that?
It may be. I certainly think that technology is going to become more and more diffused through every aspect of our company. I'm very much like the gentleman over here was saying, that it's almost part of the air that we breathe these days. But I think that we may not need programming and coding and a lot of the traditional technology aspect of IT, but we are still building systems that are very large and very interconnected, that I think is going to require reasonably smart people to figure out if you scale them up. I mean, just like we need very smart people to build the tools in the first place. If I've got a company with 100 regional offices all using Salesforce, I probably still need some systems level thinking to figure out how best to fit all that together, even if I don't need any COBOL programmers to write the underlying code. But I think that's probably another question that I should have asked. And I suspect that the typical CIO would be very much against that, because you're talking about his or her job going away. I asked a little bit of that question. I remember of Lynn Ellen is her name, a woman who was until recently the CIO of Detroit Energy. I said, isn't it true that you get people coming out of college today thinking that they know everything about software engineering because they know Excel? Or no, she was the one who used the Excel metaphor, but I said, do they have an overconfidence about their technical skills? And she was the one who said, just because you know Excel doesn't mean you know software engineering. And she said, we try to throw a lot of our younger graduates into complex situations knowing that they're going to sink, but hopefully giving them the opportunity to learn that things are a lot more complicated than they think.
And is scaring them straight, kind of? Is this
Yeah.
So I think that I think we're out of